To welcome Naomi Walker, who will be delivering the session on the UCAS reference today. Naomi has been an English teacher who had much experience of writing Oxbridge application references, and she's also our admissions coordinator here at Corpus. So she's had a lot of time, or a lot of time spent reading lots of references. So she's well placed to tell us what would make a good UCAS reference. I'll just re-emphasize again, if anybody has any questions at the end of the session, you can either turn your camera on and raise your hand and I will come to you, or you can just drop your question in the chat and I can relay it to Naomi. So without much ado, I will hand over to Naomi.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about the UCAS reference today and how to write a UCAS reference. So first of all, I just wanted to talk about why the UCAS reference is important. So it's really, really important to us because it gives us the school's view of the student within their current academic context. So it can tell us how the student's performing compared to their peers. I'm going to talk quite a lot about sort of how you show those comparisons today. We can glean quite a lot about a student's level of academic commitment from the reference. So it's really important to kind of give us that information there. And it's also really important to contextualize anything that's gone on in the student's academic career and anything about the school that it's important for us to know. So those are kind of the key things we're looking for. I'm going to unpack all of that as we go through today. And one thing I would say is that UCAS references certainly are read. Sometimes people say to me, well, is it just kind of a tick box exercise part of the UCAS application? It's certainly not. So UCAS reference is read as it comes into the admissions office. It's read by the admissions tutor and it's read by all the interviewers as well. So it's read by lots of people and it's certainly a piece of information that's used. However, it's no more important than any other of the pieces of information that we use to build a picture of an applicant. So I'd say it's just kind of part of the information that we have on an applicant, and they're all equally important parts of information. So just to give you a kind of overview of who might be involved in UCAS references, obviously it's different in every school. You'll have your own system within your own school. But there are generally probably sort of three areas of people that might be involved. So first of all, subject teachers. And I would say that these are probably the most important players in the UCAS reference writing process. They're the ones that actually know the students as academic individuals. They're the ones that can give us the academic context. They're the ones that are really best placed to tell us something about the student. Tutors and sixth form teams are normally involved, depending on the school context, obviously, but normally involved in putting the whole reference together. So whether that's the sixth form team does all of them or individual sort of personal tutors do it. I think they've got sometimes quite a hard job because I certainly know when I was a year 13 teacher, so year 13 tutor, I'd have my my tutees coming to me saying I couldn't fit this bit about Duke of Edinburgh into my personal statement, so please could you add this in my reference, and please could you say this about my grade 8 violin in my reference. And that's quite difficult because they're kind of giving you all this sort of extracurricular information that they want you to include in the reference because they've not been able to include it in their personal statement. But really, as I'm going to say today, these references should be academic, and I hope that's going to be very clear by the end of today's session. So it's quite a difficult situation sometimes for the tutor or the sixth form team to kind of have to negotiate with the student what does or doesn't go in. Obviously, ultimately, it's the teacher's reference, but I know that in some schools, the student gets an opportunity to fill out a form, for example, of other things they might want included. And sometimes you do have to say no because there's just not space. There's as much of a limit as there is on the personal statement. Head teacher or head of sixth form is normally the name that goes down at UCAS. So ultimately they are responsible for the reference because they're the listed referee in most cases. So they're normally the sort of people that are in charge of quality assurance. And it's important for head teachers and heads of sixth form to know all of this then, because if they're seeing an Oxbridge reference or a competitive university reference, all of this would equally apply to any other Russell Group university. And that reference is not particularly academic. They really should be going back to subject teachers and saying, we need more here. We need more academic information. So I know it's really quite a long process putting these references together. And hopefully whatever sort of role you fit into, whether you're a subject teacher, tutor, sixth form head, or a head teacher, hopefully there'll be information here that you can take back to your schools in terms of reference writing. So you may well have seen this slide before, this structuring the reference and example slide. I know this one comes up quite a lot in Cambridge information sessions, but hopefully this will kind of emphasize what I was saying before as well. So you can see here in the middle, 80% of the content, I would say, should be focus on the subject, with kind of contextual achievement, things I'm going to talk a little bit more about today as well. At the start, we quite often get some school or college information. I'll give you some examples of that. And sometimes people put at the end some sort of mitigating circumstances, although I think likewise those sometimes come in at the start of references. So I'm looking for mitigating circumstances in a reference. I'll normally read sort of the first paragraph and the last paragraph to quickly find it. And quite often there's a sort of concluding statement about sort of the overarching view of the student. But really what we're most interested in is the academic ability of the students. It's that 80% in the middle. You'll notice they've not referenced extracurricular here at all. So there's kind of no expectation for any extracurricular at all to come into the reference. So I'm going to go through now and just give a few tips for writing a good reference. And I'll also sort of give some things that I'd like to see and some things that I'd say we should probably try to avoid as well. So first of all, it's a good idea to include some information on the standard program of study within your school. So I'll just give some examples here. So students at our school all select 3 A-levels to study from a choice of 15 students. The only students who can, 15 subjects, The only students who complete 4 A-levels are those who take further maths. So that's quite a good example there. So it tells us that 3 A-levels is standard. So if a student's taking 3 A-levels, that's normal for the school. That's what we expect. Actually a humanities student, for example, who applies to us, who's taking 3 A-levels, probably, if they're not taking further maths, wouldn't have even had the opportunity to take 4 A-levels at your school. That's useful information for us. Students study 3 or 4 full subjects in year 12 and an enrichment program, including an EPQ. 3 or 4 subjects are continued into year 13. So with this one here, if they're given a choice of 3 or 4 subjects, then we might expect really top students to be doing 4 subjects if they're given that complete choice to do it. I think I'd say might there, because we'd always rather see 3 strong A-levels, sort of top grades of A-star, than 4 slightly weaker A-levels. 3 A-levels is our only requirement. We don't require 4 A-levels. But it's just if quite a lot of the students at school are doing 4 subjects, then we might question why a strong student within your school isn't one of those students. Next, most students study 4 subjects in year 12 and 3 in year 13. We do not predict D1 grades in the subjects that follow pre-U specifications. So pre-U is obviously, for those of you who do pre-U, you'll understand this. Pre-U is an alternative to A-level that some schools do. It's really useful information to know that D1 grades are not predicted by the school. So we should be expecting a top grade prediction for your student then to be a D2. And that sort of helps us to know that it's not that you've not been predicted a D1 because you're not the strong student. You've not been predicted a D1 just because the school doesn't predict it. The majority of our students study 3 A-levels and complete an EPQ project. Excellent information. So that's what we're expecting to see this student do, because that's what students at your school do. So I've said at the bottom here, and possibly any important contextual information at school. So for example, a little example I've written here, the mathematics department has been through 3 changes of leadership in the past 4 years, and X has unfortunately had multiple changes of class teacher in this time. That's really useful information for us because it tells us a little bit about the stability of the maths education and might sort of indicate achievement, what they might be able to achieve as well, because they've had lots of teacher changes. I'm going to come on to talk about the extenuating circumstances form soon as well. This is something that would probably be expanded upon in the extenuating circumstances form, so I'll just hold that thought and come on to that shortly. Next sort of tip is be specific about achievement. And we're seeing this increasingly in references. I think schools are actually getting very, very good at being very specific about achievement. So I've got some examples here. I'll kind of let you have a read through them. But as I'm talking about, as you'll see, all of these are kind of very specific. They tell us that they're ranked 5th out of 76, for example, that one of the most academically talented students that they've taught. And in a year group of 1,200 students, they would rank in the top 5. That clearly tells us that they're a very, very good student. all of them kind of quite similar, but very useful information for us because it tells us about the student as an academic within their cohort. One thing I would just say about number 3, so in his end of year exam, he achieved 92% and was ranked top out of 56. It's the second part of the sentence there that I'd say is more useful actually, because he achieved 92% doesn't mean that much to us because we don't know what the exam was. We don't know how strict the mark scheme was. Ranking top out of 56 is more interesting because that tells us that they are the top student in their cohort. Then the next one I put is highlight contextual flags or circumstances to be aware of. So this kind of comes back to the example where there might have been multiple changes of maths teacher, but this is kind of more circumstances that are more personal to students. So X lives in an area that has an IMD score of 36.88, placing it in the 5th quintile with a polar 4 score of 2. Her family income is just slightly above the threshold for free school meals. Now that's actually a really important one because we do get information on free school meals and free school meals eligibility. We don't get information on students who just very narrowly miss free school meals. So that's really useful to know that they are actually quite a disadvantaged student, but they don't necessarily have that flag. And those of you who were there in Dr. Lucy's talk on Tuesday, she talked quite a lot about these contextual flags and how we use that information. I think that recording will be available if you did miss that. So this kind of all links back to what she was saying there. A couple of other examples there. So first generation, their family to go to a university, we don't actually get that information from UCAS. It's not a flag that goes on their application in the same way as some of the ones that we talked about on Tuesday, but it does still tell us something about their backgrounds. It's useful information to know. This last one, I think, is an interesting one to talk about with the extenuating circumstances form. So all of X's GCSE subject teachers stated that she would have achieved even higher grades if she'd been present for the completion of the syllabus for her subjects, whilst our current teachers have commented on X's academic progress being on par with students who achieved grade 9 at GCSE level. So clearly this is a student who had something going on in GCSEs. It's not indicated exactly what it was in this statement, but probably hasn't achieved as they should have achieved, and probably tells us that we should be thinking about her GCSEs as not actually what she was capable of, which is really useful information for us. This kind of would give us a bit of an indication of that and is also useful for other universities because obviously the reference goes to all universities. But then, as I've alluded to the extenuating circumstances form already, Cambridge has this Cambridge specific form that not everybody fills in, but some people can fill in if there are extra circumstances that we should be aware of, and you can go further in explaining those circumstances then. So it's basically a form where there's space to give us more detail on individual circumstances. I would say it's not for COVID-19 related disruption. Everybody's had COVID-19 related disruption, obviously to a greater or lesser extent, depending on individual situations there. In the past 2 years, there's been a separate special form for telling us specifically about COVID-19 disruption that everybody has been asked to fill in. The university is currently thinking about how to go forward with that and how to gather that information. So please don't put that on the ECF. There'll be another way of telling us about that. Another thing to say about this form is it's to be completed by the school, not the applicant, but it is the applicant's responsibility to give it to the school and to ask the school to complete it for them. And you do have to tick a box to say that the applicant knows that you've completed it. We can't consider it if the applicant doesn't know that you've completed it. And I would say that ECFs, obviously, they can contain quite sensitive information, and you can go into quite a lot of detail about circumstances on these forms, sort of as much as is needed. They are handled very, very sensitively. They're only shared with those who need to know about the circumstances for admissions decisions. So they wouldn't necessarily even be shared with all the interviewers. They might just be shared with the directors of studies and the admissions tutor and those who actually need to know about the circumstances in order to make those overall decisions. Everyone can see if an ECF has been submitted. I mean, I say everyone, everybody who's kind of involved in the interviewing process can see if one's been submitted, but only those who really need to know the content of the information can see the detail that's submitted there. Going on to some kind of points about weaker applicants. So there are ways that you could tell us that an applicant might be slightly weaker. Obviously, most of the time we're talking about how do you tell us that your applicant is amazing. Sometimes you might get a situation, I know this from having been a teacher, where a student's applying to Oxbridge and you don't actually really think they should be applying to Oxbridge, but you obviously it's not your call whether they apply or not. You can only advise, and ultimately you have to just go ahead and support them in their decisions. But if you don't think an applicant is going to do very well here, then it's serving them best to be honest with us, serving them best and serving us best, to be honest with us about that. So some ways that you might be able to indicate to us through the reference, you could just tell us basically that you don't think they're going to meet the required grades. So if they're on target to achieve A's in all their subjects, that's not going to meet Cambridge's minimum grades, which is A star AA for most arts and humanities courses and 2 A stars and an A for most STEM courses. Or being reasonably lukewarm about ability. So quietly industrious, X has made steady progress in religious studies. So steady progress will probably tell me that they're not exactly top of the class. He takes on board the ideas of his peers and is able to respond with his own thoughts about material when called upon in lessons. So not particularly proactive if he's only responding when called upon in lessons. Obviously, I know that you always have to be positive in references, and you always should be positive in references because you want your students to go to the best university that they can possibly go to that's right for them. But you can tell us as well if you don't think that they're really going to cope with the pressure of an Oxbridge degree. Some things to avoid in terms of not supporting your students best. So if you've got students who really are strong, you want to write the best reference that you can possibly write for them. So making just unsubstantiated claims. X is courteous, hardworking, and dynamic student who has the right attributes to make him the perfect candidate for higher education. Quite possibly all true things. The sort of thing, this is a sort of statement that might be fine as a sort of an opening statement or a closing statement of a reference, but I would need to see all of that substantiated somewhere within the reference in terms of sort of hard evidence there. Focusing on personal traits rather than academic traits. So X is well-mannered and socially very adept. Lovely, but doesn't really tell us anything about them as an academic. And wasting limited characters on course content and assessment objective terminology. So here, as an example I've seen here is X's essays on whatever the essay's on demonstrate a good focus on addressing all the assessment objectives. His essays identify relevant aspects of the writer's use of form, structure, and language to shape meaning. And anyone who's an English AQA A-level teacher will recognize that writer's use of form, structure, and language to shape meaning. It doesn't mean a huge amount to Cambridge academics, and it doesn't really tell us anything about them as the individual as an academic. It just tells us that they're meeting their assessment objectives. There's a lot more you could do for that student to prove them as an academic. And then the last thing is if you write too much in extracurricular, as I've already, I think, made quite clear, we don't really need to see that. We'd far rather hear about how they're doing in their academic studies. So what I'm going to do now is I've got a few examples, a few stronger examples and a few weaker examples. I'm just going to put each one up on the screen for a few minutes for you to be able to read rather than me talking over it the whole time. And then I'll pull out a few things that hopefully you've already noticed from reading as well. So I'm just going to pause talking for a minute for you to skim through this one. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to have a quick read of that. Hopefully you're also agreeing that this is not a particularly strong section from a reference. This is probably about a third of the character limit of a reference, and there's no mention at all of academic studies. It's not even clear what subject this person's applying for at university. So I'd say this really is a waste of characters when you're really limited in what you can say. All of these make this person sound very interesting, but yeah, as I say, really doesn't tell us anything about them as an academic, which is what we want to see. So I'm going to move straight on because I think that's kind of self-explanatory, and let you read the next one. Yeah, hopefully that's given you time to have a look at that one. I'd say that this one, and hopefully you would agree, is an example of a student who really isn't suited to Oxbridge. And hopefully that's the aim of the teacher of, or the reference writer here, is actually to tell us that they're not really suited for Oxbridge. So he's beginning to show a talent for reflection. Again, I think we've got beginning a little bit later, beginning to ask more questions. I think that very much tells us that they're not there yet. They're not really suited to that fast pace of learning, especially when they say actually being challenged with the fast pace of further maths this year. I think if we read this reference, especially if they're applying for any sort of STEM subject, seeing that they've been challenged with the fast pace of further maths, we're definitely going to have some alarm bells ringing about whether they're going to cope with the maths content of any STEM course at Cambridge. Topic tests have been a bit variable. So here, again, telling us that they're not really the caliber that we're looking for. And I would say that it's not us being really mean, saying that if their topic tests have been a bit variable or they've not kept up with the pace, we're saying that they're not for us. That's not us being mean. That's actually us trying to serve your students well as well. Because if they're struggling to keep up with the fast pace of maths at school, they're really going to struggle when they come to Cambridge, and that's not good for them. That's not good for their well-being, and they'd be better off going at a different pace that's more suited to them. Moving on. Oh, the other thing I'd actually say about this one before I move on is recommend him for higher education. We see this quite a lot at the ends of references. So just saying I recommend him for higher education, I recommend him for university. I'd say that implies maybe recommend them for a university that's not necessarily an absolute top university. We tend to see, if they're really top students, we tend to see phrases that are more like recommend them for the most competitive of institutions or recommend them for a very top university. That implies that they're really pitching very high with their university applications. Moving on to this one, I'll let everyone have a quick look at this. Okay, so a very different sort of reference to the last two that we've seen. So I sort of started with the weaker ones and now I'm going to come on to the stronger ones. So I'd say this is clearly an exceptional student and it comes across really clearly in the reference as well. So this is kind of what you want to be creating in order to tell us that this is a student we should take note of when we read this reference. The thing that really makes the student stand out, and this is really what we're looking for as well, is the fact that they've clearly read outside of their schoolwork. So in preparation for our study of Dr. Faustus, she read both parts of Tamburlaine. So those of you who are English teachers, again, will know that they're both Marlowe texts. So in preparation for reading a Marlowe text that was probably part of the core A-level text and A-level study, she went away and read another Marlowe text, presumably on her own, independently. And that tells us that she's somebody who's reading beyond the curriculum, which actually is probably the most important way to prepare for an English degree at Cambridge. Also challenged herself to embark upon reading complex modernist texts in year 10. Not that we're expecting everybody to go away and read really, really hard Ulysses, for example, in year 10, which I think a lot of undergraduates struggle with reading Ulysses. We're not expecting that of everybody. What we are expecting to see of our top candidates is that they're going out and finding intellectual academic challenges and reading texts outside of their comfort zone, reading texts outside of the core set material. And that's very evident here. Her analysis is sparkling. Her observations of text are impressive for undergraduate level. Tells us that the teacher thinks a lot of her academic abilities. Similarly, in classics, has long displayed undergraduate qualities. So somebody who's at least in the school's view, very much ready to come and learn at an undergraduate level, and is going to thrive in an undergraduate environment. And again, doing lots on her own. So she's taking an A-level despite having not taken it at GCSE. Presumably she's having to go outside the curriculum, learn quite a lot on her own in order to catch up there. Work from her own translations rather than the ones offered. So she's actually completed her own translations of a whole text, which is quite impressive. And again, her sort of analysis is clearly very developed there. So it's the two things there. She's a very strong academic, very much ready to come and learn at undergraduate level in terms of her analysis, but also she's probably got herself there from the independent reading that she's got done outside of school. Those two things working together to create a very strong student. Teachers stress that she's the most extraordinary pupil they have taught. Again, that's kind of contextualizing her ability within her cohort and within what the teachers have seen previously. So a really strong reference. I'd hope you would agree there. Another one to look at for those who are more STEM minded. So in lots of ways, this reference is actually quite similar to the last one, but it's for a maths course rather than a humanities essay style course. So it's the same things that make this student really strong. It's the same things that the reference draws attention to. So it's the same idea of the most gifted mathematician they've ever worked with in a classroom. So again, contextualizing her ability within the school setting, consistently top of her cohort again. So finely tuned aptitude to logically work through the most challenging further mathematics concepts. So clearly very, very able. And that kind of goes into hand in hand with the fact that they're one of the most able that the teachers have seen previously. But then the thing that we're also really looking for, as I've said already, is that it goes beyond the classroom. So it's not just that they're very able within school and then kind of sit back because they don't really need to do very much work because they're very clever. What we want to see is if somebody's very clever and very good at maths and already knows exactly what they're doing with the A-level syllabus, what are they doing outside of that? So they say here that the passion for mathematics regularly extends beyond the classroom. And the thing that I would say is strong here is the reference writer doesn't just say it extends beyond the classroom and then moves on. We see the evidence. So she sought out problems that require problem solving skills rather than just mathematical knowledge and enjoys the intellectual challenge. So it kind of builds on saying that she goes beyond the classroom, actually says she goes and seeks out problems. Actually, this could probably be even stronger here by giving a specific example of when that's happened, or a specific example of when, for example, she goes to teachers and asks her out problems that she might have found online or in extension textbooks. So I think we could get even more specific here, but it does tell us really quite a lot still about their intellectual curiosity. And I really like this bit as well. So for timetabling reasons, the mechanics further maths module was not an option, but her inquisitive nature led her to study the aspects of mechanics that she had met in physics in greater depth. So the fact that she's gone outside of the, so she can't do that particular module in school. So she outside of school, she's teaching herself those aspects. And so she's not letting timetabling hold her back there. And I think that's quite important. So one thing I would say, I know that kind of in terms of thinking about further maths, I know some schools can't offer further maths at all. And if that's the case, then we don't want your students to be disadvantaged if the school just really can't offer further maths. But we do normally say to students who get in touch with us saying, like, I've not been able to take further maths, what should I do? that we would still want to see them trying to study modules of further maths independently. They don't have to take the exam necessarily, but they should be trying to make sure that they keep up with that content. And the fact that they go and do that independently tells us quite a lot about their determination and their motivation for the subject as well. So I'm not going to spend lots more time talking because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, because there might be things that have come up, and quite often we do get quite a few things, specific questions about content of references. But I just wanted to give you some overall takeaways. So regardless of whether you're a subject teacher, a tutor, head of sixth form, head teacher, hopefully there are things that you can kind of take back to your school and in terms of the content of a reference. So whether you're writing it, whether you're doing the sort of first level check of it, or whether you're quality assuring, hopefully you can see then that our references to be really strong, what we want to see is that they're academic, comparative, and contextualized. So they should be focused on the individual student as an academic. I've said rather than on course content, so rather than on that sort of assessment objective terminology, telling us what they've done in chemistry, that they learned about this particular module. We don't need to see that. In actual fact, we can get that information elsewhere. We want to know how they perform academically and what they've been doing outside of their schoolwork. That they're comparative, as it says, that so tell us how the student performs in relation to their cohort, that they're top in a cohort of 250, or that they performed fifth out of a very strong cohort of 30 students. Fifth out of a very strong cohort of 30 students could be as good as first out of 250, depending on the who their cohort is. So we don't really mind which it is, but just we want to know how they're performing within their cohort. And then contextualized, so tell us whether or not the applicant is taking the standard program of study for the school, as I kind of gave those examples, and do include any mitigating circumstances if relevant. And then the extenuating circumstances form can be used to develop this further. So just a line or two on that, because you probably don't want to go into lots of quite personal detail there, and then use the extenuating circumstances form to take this further. So hopefully that's been helpful as a kind of overview of writing references. I'm really happy to take questions now. So if I stop screen sharing, and then James, let me know if any questions come in.
Yeah, of course. I would probably just like to just add a little bit to what Naomi was saying. I think in particular, if you have a student who is doing a combination, I don't know, if they're applying for medieval and modern languages at what we call MML, and they might have, I don't know, French, English literature, and biology, you don't need to waste character space telling us about biology, because that's not necessarily going to have the sort of obviously relevant skills that we would look for in the MML. So you can be smart, and you can save character space in order to develop a more in-depth reflection on a student's abilities. You don't feel like you have to cover everything that the student is doing, I think. And I definitely we do see that in the admissions office. You feel the teachers feel the need to sort of include everything about their academic performance, but you can sort of box clever, so to speak, and draw out the things which is really going to be contributing to them as a historian, or them as an MML student, or them as an engineer.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And that's probably a task for, normally, I'd say the tutor or the sixth form team who are actually putting the references together. Because I know that the brief normally for teachers in schools is all the subject teachers are to write a paragraph. I know that's quite often how schools do it. And then that's kind of pasted together by one central person. But the kind of the skill there of the tutor or the sixth form team is to go back to subject teachers and say, look, they're applying for history, so I actually need another paragraph on history. I've only got one paragraph on history here. Please, could you write another paragraph on history? And then just take the best bits out of biology, for example, and just use the best sentences. You don't need to use necessarily everything that the subject teachers have given you, because otherwise, as James says, it's not all as relevant as it could be.
Great. Does anybody who's watching have any questions for Naomi? Ooh. So this is from Nicola. So what is our view on including links to web page? So she references that quite a few universities won't open these, but they wondered, do Cambridge appreciate the contextual information they often contain?
So I'd say that if you give a URL, hopefully those viewing it will have time to look up the school. But I know from reviewing the applications myself, that obviously does take extra time to then look up the URL. It is ideally easier if there's just a one sentence on the very core bit of information about school. You don't need to tell us how many students are on your roll. You don't need to tell us whether the student, whether it's a selective sixth form or not, because that's information that we have on a central database. It's more the sorts of examples I was giving, like how many A levels are studied at A level. That's really useful to see in the reference because it's right there in front of us. The more detailed information on a URL is fine. We actually have it on our own databases anyway, so we might just look it up on our own databases. Would you agree, James, from when you've been reviewing applications?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I do as the admissions team is I make one pages on every school, which is then put in the file. So everybody who, all the interviewers can have that little extra piece of contextual information. So, I mean, I do that job anyway. So again, I think just to back up what Naomi's saying, sort of personalized contextual information is really important. And, one line or two lines about the school is great. But I mean, yeah, we have access to a large database, and there's also people in the admissions offices who will be, reviewing and checking what schools their candidates are coming from. So it's not necessarily that important. Anything else from anybody?
There's a question up at the top about further mathematics. Should I just cover that?
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, of course you can.
Yeah, I might have sort of covered it, but just to clarify, so somebody's asked whether we expect further mathematics to be taken as a fourth A level. So there's not really an expectation here. As you said in your question, it is commonly the case that students will take further maths as one of four A levels. Quite often schools will say we do three A levels here, but four if you're doing further maths, as the example I gave. But that's not the case that we expect it from everybody. The difficulty with kind of A-level changes and things like that, and the fact that most students do three A-levels now, is that it becomes difficult if further maths is then not an option. And I know some schools don't like it to be three A-levels, maths, further maths +1, because they feel that that's not broad enough for the student. In actual fact, if three A-levels is all that your student's able to do, and they're applying for pretty much any STEM course, certainly anything like physics, engineering, maybe less so biology, but physics, engineering, chemistry to an extent, computer science, maths, obviously, then if they're only doing three A-levels, it has to be maths and further maths +1. They don't have to be doing four, but if there's an option to do four and to keep their subjects broader, I know that's probably preferred for you and for them. And that's what I'd say there, I think.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And also, again, I mean, I check to see if your sixth forms offer further maths, so I can see, if the candidate has decided not to take it. And then I think someone's just said, well, what if there's no further maths on offer at school? Again, we can't discriminate against students, and any student who is at a school which does not offer further maths, we would expect them to go out and start engaging with further maths as best as they can on their own. And there are quite a few websites, but even you can go through the maths department website at Cambridge itself, where they have guides on how you can start to engage with further maths on your own. That's right, isn't it, Naomi, I think?
Yeah. So a website I particularly recommend there for students who aren't able to access further maths is Isaac Physics. That's a really, really good website for pushing maths further. It's kind of solving maths through physics problems, but it really does extend the mathematics skills as well. For a course like maths, to be completely honest, if they've just not studied further maths, they're going to really struggle here, and they're not set up well to do well here, if that's the case. However, as James said, we don't want to discriminate. So what we'd probably say to that student is to see whether they can independently study at least further maths AS on their own, maybe with teacher support if it's available, but maybe independently. And there are lots of resources online to support that independently. The teacher then has the important job of flagging that in the reference. Okay, so it's really important to then know that the school doesn't offer further maths, that we know that that's not, that's just the situation the student was in, rather than that they chose not to take it, and that they've gone out and they're doing it on their own. Then that tells us quite a lot about the student's motivation. But we understand it's difficult if they can't take further maths, but they really need to still have the subject content and ability of somebody who was taking further maths.
There's a question here, Naomi, about what value do we attach to attendance at summer schools or other courses offered by Oxbridge?
So in terms of mentioning that in the reference, the same goes for in the personal statement. No value at all to the fact that they have attended them necessarily. Okay, so I suppose if they're a very selective one and they've been accepted onto a very selective summer school or course, then it tells us something about the fact they've got through that selection process. But actually, we're doing the work there in terms of deciding whether they're meeting selection criteria for us. What's more valuable is their reflections on that, or the takeaways from that, or the independent learning skills that they've learned from that. So probably I'd say that's more something for a personal statement than a reference, most likely. What I'd like to see is the student saying, I went on this summer school, on this summer school, I attended a lecture by X on Y, really piqued my interest. So I went off and found an extra article on it. And I've kind of been doing my own independent research project on that ever since. That's something I'm really interested to see. And it tells us really a lot about the student's motivation, rather than the fact that they intended it as sort of a fact.
Yeah, with all of these things, yeah, it's always about what is the impact it's had upon the student. And so just to plug Corpus's own programs, so for example, we've got the master classes coming up. And again, attendance for that, okay, it's good, but we would be looking for, okay, well, how did they then take on board something they learned? How did it inspire them in a certain way? Did you suddenly notice, renewed focus and drive, or however it may be? But it's always about sort of just showing us the effect it's had on the student in a positive way, and the contributions it's made to their application and their potential. And then the same thing, even with something which is really highly selective, which we run something called the Pelican programs here, which is helping develop supercurricular study for the arts and humanities. Now, of course, we know that that's highly selective, and other Cambridge colleges knows that's highly selective. And so again, you would still be looking for not just the fact they were nominated and selected, it's how did they benefit from coming on that board and that program. That's always what we're looking for. I've got another question. Do we value project work for STEM subjects? So for something like celestial mechanics simulation, this is where you find out that both Naomi and I are arts and humanities students, or are problem solving competitions and admissions testing more important? That's a great question. You can answer that, Naomi.
Sure. I think the phrase more important is one that we really try to avoid in sort of a whole admissions process. There's nothing that's more important than another thing. Every single aspect kind of goes together to build up this picture of a student. So yes, admissions testing, it certainly is something that we use in thinking about who to invite for interview. If they're not meeting a standard, not that there's a certain cutoff or anything, but if they're clearly not performing in admissions testing, unless there's quite a lot in the rest of the application to show that they're going to be a competitive applicant, they might not be suitable, and we might not interview them. But whether they're doing problem solving on their own, whether they're going and doing practical projects on their own, it really doesn't matter, I don't think, as long as they're pursuing their own interests. And I think we don't want to see students who are just studying for exams and only looking at course content, whether that's A-level course content or whether that's the natural sciences admissions assessment course content as well. But students who are using their free time to explore academic ideas, it doesn't matter whether it's practical or theoretical, I don't think. If that doesn't answer it, then do feel free to come back, because I might have misunderstood it.
Yeah, and I would also, particularly for those candidates who are interested in things like aeronautic engineering, they tend to say, like, I built my own rocket, or I built my own plane.
Great.
And then the best thing, the very best ones then link that to the more theoretical or the competition side, like the more academic problem solving. And those applications really jump out when you have that combination. Great. Any other questions for myself or Naomi? Great. I think that's it. 45 minutes is enough at the end of a long day. Great. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Naomi for doing the presentation. Really appreciate you giving up the time to do it. And if anybody has any other questions that they want to direct to either myself or Naomi, then you will have our email address, which is just admissions@corpus.cam.ac.uk. So yeah, please feel free to get in contact with us, and hopefully be reading some of your teacher references soon. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.